Okay, so political theory, decolonial, and comparative political theory. Yesterday was somewhat beginning in the philosophical background, both epistemological and metaphysical, and phenomenological and intersubjective. Today, we're going to move on to the way that we can understand what to do with that sort of background, or why such a background is important. And so the talk of the first hour will more or less cover these categories very simply. What is political theory? What does it do? What is decolonial theory? Decolonial versus postcolonial theory? Comparative political theory, and then how to move from comparative political theory to Indian political theory. When we talk about political theory, we need to keep in mind political philosophy. I don't make much of a distinction between political theory and political philosophy. This might bother some people. I've received fairly harsh criticism about this in the past, but from my own experience, I teach, as I've mentioned, in political science departments, and I teach in philosophy departments. And what I teach in political science is what I teach in political philosophy. And in philosophy department, it's called political philosophy, and in political science departments, it's called political theory. Now, there may be some substantive orientational differences, but they're certainly not as severe as, for any lawyers here, the distinction between jurisprudence and the philosophy of law. Those, they address different areas of theorization, but political theory and political philosophy do not. And you can just look back at the history of what political theorists study, for example, theory, democratic theory, contract theory, and where did these arise? Machiavelli, Hobbes, people who were either counselors, tutors, not within the academic system, or if they were in the academic system, taught philosophy and not political science. All right, so political theory is a discipline. It's an academic discipline. And when we talk about what can you do with an academic discipline, we have to realize that academic disciplines entail all kinds of discipline. Self-discipline, disciplining oneself. Today I have to sit down and read and write. This is a self-discipline. Why do you undertake that discipline? Because of the discipline of political theory as an academic discipline. It also requires disciplining others, to discipline someone, right? To praise or to blame. And who is it that determines what qualifies as praiseworthy academic political theory and what qualifies as blameworthy academic political theory? There are numerous procedural issues that are fairly easy to agree upon. Remember, procedure is always easier than substance. Right? This is a basic principle both in political science, philosophy, and law. So procedurally, we know what is required in writings. We know footnotes are required, for example. In fact, this is a bad... I noticed that the author of this citation is missing, so I've just done something blameworthy from the academic political theoretical point of view. And everybody can agree on this, right? The substance of it, we'll all disagree. But on the fact that I left off the author, we can all agree procedurally I've just done something wrong and I need to be disciplined for this. So who is it who patrols the borders of what qualifies what's inside the discipline and what's outside the discipline? And who disciplines the disciples? Who's going to discipline me for this lapse that I just undertook? So we need to realize that when we're in an academic setup, our discipline is not some free-floating abstraction that anyone, it's not like the cloud, right, in internet technology that anyone can access or download from. Even that has procedures, right, which are under threat now with the removal of internet neutrality. So these accesses of the discipline are determined through specific channels and portals. And what political theorists have largely failed to do is to figure out what is the impact of those channels. Is that, am I doing that? They're building this room today? So what is the impact of these channels or institutional issues on the substance? Okay, so there are some very simple experiences that we all share where you understand this. I find standing in front of a group of people in this situation on an elevated stage puts us into a specific kind of relationship, an institutional relationship, which in some respects has a determination of the content, what it is that I say, the authority behind what I say, whether I have to account for what I say or I can dismiss a question. If it's a hard question, I'm standing here, I have the microphone. You ask me a substantive question, but the nature of the institutional framework, the way that your physical bodies are oriented in relationship to my physical body, I stand, I'm elevated, you sit, your back is straight, you're at a desk, all of these infrastructural issues determine the content of the discipline, right? Now, what has been happening in the discipline of political theory? I hope you had the time to read this paragraph. Shall I read it, or you've read it? So let me point out, the explanatory and normative power in the political world is rarely the referent for our work, for the work of political theorists, or the index of its worth. Now this is interesting because you realize in the notions of intentionality and intersubjectivity when we were speaking yesterday, what would this be referred to in epistemology? Solipsism, right? Where the reference is internal. That means that political theory, from the philosophical, epistemological point of view, is engaged in various acts of solipsism and self-reference that sets its conditions and terms for success, not in an explanatory power on the nature of the experience which theory is supposed to explain, but rather with internal references. So the solipsist doesn't really have the problem. Let's say that two of you start fighting, okay, physically. That's not the solipsist is unconcerned with a pacific relationship or a violent relationship. All right. Now, political theory then has got this procedural, institutional framework wherein it is not accountable for its failures to explain experience. Now, what does political theory do then if it's not really addressing, theorizing experiential phenomena that we in the political world are faced with on a daily basis? Well, there are various explanations. I prefer these. There are a number of other ones, but I thought the Marxist one is familiar to everybody. We all grew up on these sorts of ideas, right? The ideological function of theory. Everybody's familiar with that idea of the dependency of the superstructure on the base. So ideological ideas are determined by the social and economic foundations, and there's a relative lack of autonomy of those ideological ideas from that foundation. So irrespective of the critique that one might make against the foundation, the system is so constructed that that critique comes back to serve the strengthening of the foundation, right? So I critique Rutledge, and who benefits from that critique? Rutledge. So the ideological dependency on the base. Now, this is Marx's idea, not necessarily Marxists' ideas, as you know, because orthodox Marxism maintains a strict dependency between ideology and base, and then subsequent Marxisms want a relative autonomy. But the basic idea is that what political theory is doing, if it is not coping, shedding light on actual political experiences, is then serving in some respects to justify them. So what academic political theory does in this Marxist perspective is that it, in the practices, in the publications, in the all of the things, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention Wendy Brown. Wendy Brown was the author of the first paragraph. In all of these issues that Wendy Brown mentions, what is happening is that the institution is itself gaining a certain sort of strength, and the status quo, which it doesn't destabilize, is itself being reified and supported. In other words, simpler words, what political theory does is it reinforces the status quo in society. Now that's terrible. That's sad. This is a very concrete position. As I said, there are others, there are rivals, there are alternatives, but this is something that we need to keep in mind, because it is not something that somebody like me, when I decided I wanted to become an academic and change the world, I didn't realize that by becoming an academic, I was going to make the world even worse. Okay, so another formation, Wallerstein, I'm assuming he's German, Wallerstein, Emanuel Wallerstein, I really don't know his origins. He's a sociologist. World systems theory. Are people familiar with in sociology? Okay. So what Wallerstein argues in a brilliant book, Open the Social Sciences, I think it was published in the 60s, he speaks of why political theory, or why the social sciences more generally, specifically sociology, economics, and political science, why these social sciences do in fact serve the status quo, is because that was their very disciplinary origin. That's why they exist. Now, any historian of institutions, of social science institutions, should be fairly familiar with this. You went to SOAS, right? Okay. So Dr. Sambaya can be in a very good position to confirm or reject that institutions such as SOAS were constructed precisely in order to train its students in a knowledge that could be deployed for state vantage, right? Specifically for Britain in its colonial extraction from the African and Oriental world. So, yeah, area studies is a very late invention, though. So think about it in these terms. Area studies is, in fact, supposed to be something of a solution, and this is the irony. But I'm glad you mentioned it. We can talk about that as well. So what's happening? So we have economists here, right? And other social scientists? Yes? Economist or sociology? And your PhD is called? PhD? Social anthropology. But it's a PhD, right? DPhil. Okay. So did you study philosophy? You studied social anthropology. Yeah. So this is what I'm trying to say. Why are you not given a D Soc Anth? Yes. Now, why is it always? We need to ask ourselves this question, right? Anyone who has a economics degree, political science PhD? Anybody has political science? So is it called a D. Paul Sci? What's it called? Doctor of Philosophy. Have you asked yourself, why did you give me the wrong diploma? I'm not like those people. They just talk in abstractions. Yeah. Okay, so why is it that each of us in the social sciences receives diplomas or degrees in the year 2017 in philosophy? We need to understand why. Because from the 11th to the 16th century, in the construction of the academic university as we know it, in other words, the model of this institution where we're sitting right now, not the Arab institutions or the gurukuls or the many rival sorts of institutions of study or learning that have existed throughout the world, but the modern European public institution that is the model for this. From the 11th to 16th century, it was just training priests, right? We talked about Thomas Aquinas He was at the Sorbonne receiving a doctor in theology. Okay? Doctor of theology. Theology was the only faculty that existed in European universities from the 11th to the at least 15th century. Then what happened? Secularism, Reformation, the Protestant movement, and the basic secularization of public institutions. And the theological function, training priests, turned into training people in religious studies more generally, or basically what was referred to as philosophical studies. It was a secularized theology. Philosophy has secularized theology, which incidentally is another position of Carl Schmitt, who was mentioned yesterday. Then what happens from the 16th to the 18th century, everyone is granted a philosophy degree, and certain institutions, some of the greatest ones that we know of, have only one faculty, and it's now the Faculty of Philosophy. And if you study political things, or if you study social things, anthropology wasn't there yet, if you study the economic matters, you're granted a degree in philosophy because it's the only thing that exists in the institution. And then subsequently, we get another opening of this discipline into specific schools. But why do we get it? Why do we get the emergence of sociology, economics, and political science, what are called the nomothetic social sciences? Why do we get them in this period, 1850 to 1945? Everybody knows about this era, right, in terms of SOAS and other formations, because the state needs this information. The state needs this kind of data for governance. The function of sociology historically, according to Wallerstein, is in some respects identical to the ideological function of disciplines in Marx's conception. Not completely, but it corroborates in some respects. It's not a philosophical position, right? The problem with Marx's position is that it can't be disproved. So if you can't disprove it, you can't prove it, and then it becomes faith. But Wallerstein is not. He's giving a historical layout. Now, utility for the state, the political function, and maintaining the status quo by explaining or justifying the gap between norms and practices, the social function. So each of us as a political philosopher or political theorist has to explain why is it that we have liberty and equality as fundamental principles in our Constitution, as inalienable, and yet none of us has any of it, right? So what is the job of the political theorist? To get into that gap, and some might say to criticize it, but if you look at it from this perspective, it's to justify it. Because the more you talk about it, the more you normalize it. And the more you normalize it, the more you explain it. So political theory is largely an effort or exercise of maintaining the status quo through very complicated ideas. I'm not telling you to accept this. I'm saying this is a very prominent position within the philosophy of social sciences and the history of social science institutions. So what is to be done about that situation? Decolonial theory is a, let's say, meta-discipline or an approach to political theory and to sociology and anthropology, the humanities and social sciences more broadly, that attempts to break from the ideological and historical circumstances that tend to govern the content of the research production. So if the content of research production within most humanities and social science disciplines is determined by the procedure, how it is done, the institutions where it is done, and the history of why it is done, what decolonial theory attempts to do is to find a way out of those fixes, those binds, so that the theory being generated is not necessarily reinforcing the status quo and is in fact challenging it, and is not necessarily reinforcing the infrastructure that allows that, procedurally allows that content to be changed. So very simply, seminar tables instead of lecture halls. This is a very simple architectural thing that can be done to, in some respects, deal with the problem that I think is very palpable for me, which is to stand in front of people with a microphone and share my GIAN. So obviously I have just as much to learn from you if what I were interested in were explaining the phenomena of the social and political world. But remember, as a discipline, it's not my job. I'm a solipsist. And this is a much better infrastructure for my solipsism. I don't have to look at any of you. I just keep talking. Okay. So this architecture reinforces the ideological function of the discipline, and there are now movements, this is a long-standing one from way back 60s, 70s, in fact originates in liberation theology, if any of you are familiar with that, that attempts to start to dismantle both procedurally and substantively the problems of the reinforcement of ideology, social and political status quo. So Mignolo is, I think, one of the most significant. Walter Mignolo, I just put one of his books, The Darker Side of Western Modernity, Global Futures, Decolonial Options. Quijano, everyone refers to Quijano as an anthropologist because you know you know that sociologists and anthropologists, you can be a sociologist in India, but if you go to the UK, you suddenly are an anthropologist because Indians are objects of study. Partha Chatterjee is now teaching in which? Okay. Now, Dussel, a Mexican philosopher, Philosophy of Liberation was one of his great works. These are sources or resources for how to rethink and restructure and rework what political theory is supposed to do. So decolonial theory is a great inspiration for political theorists around the world, and predominantly in what is referred to as the global south. And so another idea has emerged, which is referred to as Southern theory. Now, Southern theory was supposed to answer the conundrums of the fact that the East-West distinction doesn't make any sense for the reasons that we discussed yesterday. The problem is the North-South distinction doesn't make much sense either, but let's leave that aside. So within Southern theory, it gets grouped. Great philosophers like Pauline Huntonji from Benin, I don't know how to pronounce the country, and Huntonji is connected to a renaissance in autonomous African political and social philosophical reflections. So in attempting to reconfigure why the universities within Africa, certainly sub-Saharan Africa largely, preponderantly simply replicate the universities that were created under colonial rule. That sounds familiar, right? So we share a lot of these same issues. Les Savoirs Endogènes, the Indigenous Knowledges is one of his greatest works. Rywin Connor, an Australian sociologist who wrote a book called Southern Theory, and Boaventura de Sousa Santos from Portugal, a legal sociologist. He comes to India very much. Does anyone know Boa? Yeah? He's great. Yes, he's a good friend of Ashish Nandi, and Epistemologies of the South was one of his path-breaking books, but he's published a 5-volume set which he characterizes as Another World is Possible. Okay, so these are 5 volumes where he describes the way that the disciplines within humanities and social sciences can begin to both reflect the experiences that we face in the so-called Global South more accurately with its own set of concepts. And in so doing, if you're not then, through your discipline, reinforcing the status quo, then you are disturbing the status quo. And through the processes of disturbance of the status quo, you realize through the work you do in the humanities and social sciences that another world is possible. Not the world that we keep saying is the only possibility. You know Tina, right? There is no alternative. Tina. So there is no alternative. This is the sort of haze or cloud that's beginning to cover over all of us. That it's very nice to speak about resistance, but there is no alternative to global capitalism. Even Zizek has said it. Jameson has said it, right? The great Marxists. There is no alternative to capitalism. So Tina, this problem, there is no alternative, is given, is shown the lie by this sort of work that says another world is possible. If the institutions do not reinforce the status quo and reinforce the ideology that another world is not possible, but instead conduct research, both empirical and theoretical, that lays a foundation, a groundwork for the possibility of another world. This is why decolonial theory, I think, is extremely important new attitude, approach that academics within the humanities and social sciences should take very seriously. So this is not my text, but I don't remember whose it is. Okay. I don't know how you work, but I read something that I like, I scribble it down, it gets lost in all my papers, and then I find out that I thought it was mine. And then, so now I run everything that I write through, what is it called? Turnitin or something like that, before I ever show it to anybody. But since I did this yesterday, I know this is not mine, but I don't know where it came from. But this tells us what is decolonial and Southern theory trying to do. Demystify mainstream and dominant discourse, including those that present themselves as alternatives to coloniality. In other words, they interrogate the genuineness of discourses that present themselves as alternatives to Orientalism and Eurocentrism. This is crucially important. What is he trying to say, he or she? In fact, if it's Raewyn O'Connor, she's transgender, so I don't know what is he or she trying to say. There's a lot on offer as a rival or alternative to hegemonic discourse, right? We could become spiritualists and just absolve our responsibility of the world and wander off into the forest and decide that, you know, I'm not interested. These things do not concern me. I'm not, that's not what I am. I'm some higher spiritual process. And this could be an attitude that we take to, I do not want to reinforce the status quo, so I'm going to exclude myself from the status quo or attempt to exclude it. Spiritualism, ascetic spiritualism, wandering off into one's own internal self-reflective spiritual processes. It's a viable, it is a frequently articulated alternative. Sri Aurobindo is a pretty good example of someone who represents something that could be reflected like that. So what decolonial theory does is that it does not just interrogate mainstream or dominant political theory that is hegemonic, transatlantic political theory. It also interrogates the opposites that are produced, let's say, in the Global South. Do you understand the importance of this gesture? So decolonial theory doesn't say that we do not want the hegemon, so we will take whatever you have for us in Benin or in Kerala or in wherever you want to say it. Rivals to the hegemon must themselves be interrogated from the vantage point of decolonial theory. I don't know why that's so hard for me to express. I hope you understand what I'm saying. No, you don't understand what I'm saying. All right. Generally, we think, let's look in terms of postcolonial theory. Postcolonial theory, did we discuss it yesterday? We're going to discuss it now. It has like a Syed, it has a reflective or critical attitude about the sources of the dominant or hegemonic ideas. And then it suggests then that there's been some purity, some innocence that has been violated by colonial conquest. But what decolonial theory says is, show me that purity. Show me that authenticity that you think we have so radically violated. So decolonial theory is equally critical of rivals to hegemony as it is critical of hegemonic ideas. Was that better? Okay. So they present theoretical conceptual alternatives and academically dependent social science. What is academic dependency? It's based on this idea of dependency theory. Any of you who have studied dependency theory in economics or sociology or political science. We have academic dependency. The work is produced in the center, and that's where it's generated. Where? London, Oxford, New York, Boston. Everything that everybody in this room thinks is of academic importance for progress in the discipline, according to the rules and norms of the discipline, what the Wendy Brown quotation. So publications, seminars, promotions, journal articles, and so on. Everything that we guide our internal processes according to are developed in London, Boston, New York, and Oxford. This is a dependency relationship that we have on them. I'll give you a concrete example if you're skeptical. At JNU, in order to be promoted to a full professor, you need those API points, right? What are the list of journals that you can publish in? How many of them are Indian journals? Okay, any journal can be refereed. Even Indian journals can be refereed.
Actually, unless they are published or mentioned in that UGC list,
Yeah.
They are not accountable for. That's the current scenario.
Yes, but where are those journals from that are mentioned in the UGC list? Yeah, exactly. Okay. Now, I'll give you one funny example. At CPS, Center for Political Studies, and you know, you can't list 1,000 journals. You can only list a few. CPS, to get promoted to full professor, now, of course, no professors, they were all grandfathered in. Out of the 20 journals where you can publish, one of them is Philosophy and Public Affairs. Philosophy and Public Affairs is the most difficult journal to be published in, and no single Indian out of 1.2 billion, except for Amartya Sen, has been published in that journal. And yet, out of 20 options for where you can publish in order to become a professor at the Center for Political Studies of JNU, you need to publish where? Okay? This is dependency, and it shows a kind of perversion of the way that we trigger and evaluate our expectations internal to our discipline. So, to put it in another way, what does it matter if you have explained any single thing about Indian social and political realities in this internal process? They don't matter. Dependency is what characterizes the way that our discipline evolves, and the reason that you take certain people seriously, who you can cite, who you cannot cite, and other issues like this. So decolonial Southern theory challenged this. They take local non-Western knowledge traditions seriously as sources of ideas and concepts for the social sciences, learning from and not just about them. What does that mean? Area studies. Okay. What does area studies mean? I've taught in an area studies department for one semester, and the thing that I was amazed by was that, I don't know how Gopal Guru intuited it, what's happening in Boston. Every empirical work was authored by a native. Every theoretical work was authored by a white, male, in fact, Protestant American in area studies. Okay. Now, of course, there are many colors participating, many genders participating, all of that. This was just this particular institution, which happens to be an Ivy League institution. which means it sets the standards for us, right? Now, how is it that this scenario can continue in the year 2017? Because what area studies does is it learns about the areas. It does not learn from the areas. So it learns about the areas, it brings the empirical information in and implements its own theoretical apparatus as the explanation. Theorists are from the transatlantic world, and it's our job in Indian academia to send them information. What Gayatri Spivak refers to as, how does she call it? The native informant. So decolonial Southern theory wants to challenge this and begin to generate the theory from the area as opposed to just generating the data that gets theorized in the transatlantic world. So this is a very important distinction. They imagine alternatives at level of knowledge production as well as political economy. So do you remember the TINA hypothesis? There is no alternative to global capitalism. This, I think, is referring primarily to Boaventura de Souza Santos's works on rival economies, alternative economies, small is beautiful, and all of these others. And they serve democratic ends and are not disconnected from their political, economic, and cultural milieu. That means challenging that last part of what Wendy Brown had said we are all engaged with, reifying the status quo, and ignoring our political, economic, and cultural milieu in the sort of solipsistic theory that we're engaged with at Indian universities. So postcolonial theory, we've all heard about. India becomes the land of postcolonialism in December and January when every NRI comes back to India, right? We're postcolonial for 2 months out of the year. Okay, the other 10 months, I don't know what we're doing, but for 2 months we're postcolonial. Why? Because postcolonialism emerged around the ideas of Syed, 1978, and primarily Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Spivak, South Asians who dominate postcolonial theory largely. There are some West Asians, intellectuals, but basically postcolonial theory is dominated by South Asians, and not just South Asians, basically by Indians. It's characterized by a commitment to culture. In fact, that's the name of one of Homi Bhabha's greatest works. Is that, who's buzzing? I feel like it's me. Is it this? Do I have a, do you hear that buzzing? Okay. Okay. So I'll ignore it. Decolonialism, on the other hand, emerges from Quijano and Mignolo and world systems theory. In other words, that relationship that Wallerstein had created in terms of the historical emergence of the disciplines. Postcolonialism emerges from diasporic scholars, South Asian diasporic scholars. What does that mean? Where does postcolonialism happen? London, Oxford, New York, and Boston. In fact, probably, I'm making a joke now, but probably you could, the entire library of postcolonial theory was produced at Columbia University, right? Gayatri Spivak and now Partha Chatterjee and Homi Bhabha at Harvard. And University of Chicago. Decoloniality, on the other hand, emerged from South America and refers back to imperial interlocutors addressing a much longer time frame, from the 15th century. So South America's experience with colonization and coloniality goes back, as you know, to the 15th century, whereas South Asia's experience emerges from 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. So postcolonial theory is preoccupied with a narrower time frame, a narrower institutional genealogical origin, and most importantly, the books about post-colonial theory are almost exclusively published in New York, London, Oxford, and Boston. So what am I trying to suggest? Post-colonial theory is Western philosophy. Okay? Now, why am I saying this? We still have not come to any agreement about what characterizes something as Western or Indian. Somebody had asked that one. We'll discuss that. But when we know that the knowledge production serves internally advancement issues, career issues, disciplinary issues, and we know that you become a full professor by publishing in certain journals and in certain ways, the industry of postcolonial theory has served whose interests? It has served the interests of the postcolonial theories who are not in India except December and January. Okay? Why are they in India in December and January? Because they're coming from Colombia, and we have to adore people who are coming from Colombia, so let them come in and maybe give them a GIAN course to... okay, so this is a crucial issue. This is a crucial issue that is totally neglected in the content of political theory, okay, in the publications. Now, anthropologists, every time you write a monograph, you have an initial chapter where you give your location, right? Who I am, what I do, maybe my gender, my language skills, any interests that show the way that who I am, what I do, where I'm from, what I speak, what I know, might mediate, moderate, distort what it is that I'm about to say in the following case chapters, right? Chapters 2, 3, 4, 5 are all about them, and chapter 1 is usually, or the introduction is usually about me. Is that how we do political science? Sorry? Oh. Yeah. Yeah, so in Indian political theory, I lay out 5 books in contemporary anthropology, which all follow that. And the Oxford series on anthropologies all have mandated that. So I don't know what, I mean, I've never read an anthropological work that doesn't do that. So, yeah. So can you please check the books that I've referenced in the, you don't have a copy of the book? Okay. So do we do this identification, location in political science? Somehow in political science we're deracialized, ungendered, uncaste, caste-free, gender-free, race-free, class-free, which anybody knows, if you're engaged in a sociological and anthropological exercise, distorts or disrupts the way that you experience and articulate the object of your study, the people that you're studying, the relationships that you're studying, the systems that you're studying. Why is political science free of this articulation? Largely because of its own location. Why the political scientist is able to universalize him or herself is because of where the political scientist is situated. This book cannot be called political theory. It has to be called Indian political theory. If I tried to send it to the publisher and say political theory, well, what's it about? It's about all of the work that Indian political theorists are doing today. Oh, you mean it's Indian political theory? But if I lived in Oregon, I don't even know where Oregon is, or Alabama, or someone told me Utah. No, Utah I know where it is. Ohio. Okay, every single person in my work is a colleague at the University of. No, there's one mysterious state. I don't know where it is. Ohio, I know. Anyway, Idaho or something like that. You know, these far-flung areas within even the United States. And everybody on the list of contributors is from this place that none of us has ever heard of. Do they have to call it Iowan political theory? There's an asymmetry, right, of the possibility of universalizing based on the locality where the research is effected. So political science, especially political theory, assumes automatically that it comes from no area. It comes from the only area that happens to be the universal area. And area studies then was implemented subsequently as a corrective measure, but largely until 2010, area studies had a strict division between where theory is generated, because theory has to be universal, that's part of its definition, and where the empirical information is coming from. This posed a very big problem to transatlantic political philosophers, sociologists, anthropologists, and lawyers who realized that this situation, this scenario, is not bad for the areas, it is in fact bad for the center. How is that so? Because if we do not recognize what is happening theoretically in the rest of the world, we are missing out empirical information. So Southern theory turns out to be empirical data for the transatlantic world. And comparative political theory emerged in order to begin to deal with generation in terms of production of theorizations within the global south, within decolonial theory, within postcolonial theory, within African political theory, and so on. Now the question is, then is that what we need in our political science departments, in our political theory departments, in order to break dependency, in order to generate our own theory that is truer to the realities, the empirical realities that we find ourselves faced with on a daily basis in our political economy? Is that going to help us? Well, this is yet another sort of transatlantic self-reflection. And so today, as wonderful people as Fred Delmeyer is, one of the most wonderful people I know, and he's also in India all the time. But he takes globalization seriously, but for whose interest? So in contrast to hegemonic or imperialist modes of theorizing, the term implies that comparative political theory implies that global civil society cannot be monopolized by one segment of its population. This is the activist version of comparative political theory. It is not fair in terms of global civil society that only white Protestant males should dominate the discourse. Okay, we all agree with that, but what is global civil society? Global civil society is itself a concept generated from the transatlantic world to explain dependent relationships, or the attempt to overcome dependent relationships between the transatlantic world and the rest of the areas. And about what comparative political theory claims is that it has to be dialogical. So why does Fred Delmeyer come to India all of the time? To have conversations with political philosophers or sociologists and so on in India or in Iran, Shariati, all of the places where theory is emerging in the South. And then in terms of procedure, how do you do it? There's a requirement in comparative political theory degrees of multilinguality. In other words, very similar to anthropological requirements from places like SOAS, where, interestingly, and I don't think it's an accident, the very first MA of comparative political theory was founded. And why am I bullying SOAS? Because we know why SOAS was formed in the first place. My suggestion is there's a reason why they formed the first comparative political theory program hundreds of years later. It is a consistent effort of the transatlantic world to more perfectly universalize itself. It's not an effort that from which we, who are attempting to overcome the problems that we might find that were described by Marx or by Wendy Brown or by Wallerstein, that we can use in order to generate authenticity in our own political theory. Now, who has made that argument? Postcolonial theorists? No, why would they? Why would a postcolonial theorist argue that comparative political theory is a more complete or perfect universalization of transatlantic hegemony? Because that's what postcolonial theory itself does. So they're not going to argue it. Interestingly, this proposition was put forward by Decolonial theory. According to decolonial theorists, comparative political theory is just a more perfect universalization of transatlantic political theory. Thus, to cultivate a more comparative political theory would scarcely contribute to the authenticity and autonomy of political theory as practiced elsewhere around the globe, for example, among Indian political theorists. So what we need, we don't know who we are yet. We haven't determined this identity problem. What we need, simply put, as academics functioning in the disciplines of the humanities and social sciences in Indian universities, what we need is not comparative political theory. That's another kind of native informant, but it's a native theoretical informant as opposed to a native empirical informant. What we need instead is an authentic and vibrant Indian political theory. But what does that mean? What is Indian political theory? That's the topic of the next